This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitzahone, and today I'm continuing with my limited set review for Alchemy Horizons Baldur's Gate. So far, I've covered every multicolored white, blue, and black card in the set, and today we're continuing with red. For each of these cards, I'll give you my thoughts on the card and then sum up those thoughts with a letter grade. If you're not sure what my letter grades mean, you'll find an explanation in the description. Keep in mind, in this video, I'm only giving my predictions for how good I think these cards will be in the limited formats. Also, because I haven't actually played with most of these cards, I am definitely going to be wrong about some of them. As we start playing the format, I'll give updates on my thoughts in my Needs and Notes series, which comes out every Saturday. Alright, let's take a look at our first red card from Alchemy Horizons Baldur's Gate. First up, it's Chaos Balor, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 4/5 mythic rare demon with flying, and when it attacks or dies, you choose 2, and each mode must target a different player. And these modes are: target player discards all the cards in their hand, then seeks that many non-land cards. Chaos Balor deals 2 damage to target player and they create 2 treasure tokens, and Chaos Balor deals 2 damage to each creature target player controls. Those creatures perpetually get +2/+0. This card has a fitting name because its attack and death triggers are pretty chaotic. All of the abilities give you something that can be bad and something that can be good. Because you have control over the ability, you're going to be able to choose what is best for you and worst for your opponent, so it's going to play out better than it looks most of the time. If you really need mana, you'll be happy to do 2 damage to yourself to do it. If your opponent has a bunch of X2s you can kill, you'll be happy to kill those creatures and perpetually give them +2/+0. Even if it means your opponent's other creatures also get buffed. Similarly, if using the ability on your own stuff can give you lethal, you probably do that. I think the most common use with the card will be to throw away a land or 2 to seek 1 or 2 non-land cards while doing one of the other effects on your opponent. Giving them a treasure has a tendency to not really matter late, and because you have a 4/5 flyer, you're going to be hitting them pretty hard. Now, no doubt about it, this card is going to be a bit awkward sometimes, but overall, I think you get a reasonably efficient flyer that's going to have abilities that really are more good for you than they are bad for you. And I don't think it's quite a bomb. I think the weird nature of the card holds it back from that, but I think it's a B+, which is quite good. Next up, it's Craving of Yinogu, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant creature you control. The enchanted creature gets +3/+2, has haste, and attacks each combat if able, and you can pay 1 red mana to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield attached to target creature you control, and Craving of Yinogu perpetually gains. Enchanted creature gets -1/-1, activate only as a sorcery. This one was my preview card, and it seems like a decent aura, especially once you get it in the graveyard. The fact it can keep coming back is nice, although after the second time you bring it back, you are getting negative stats to go with the haste, which makes it a lot less good. Those first 2 activations are pretty nice, though, for the amount that you're getting. Sort of like paying a kicker of 1 red mana to give a creature +2/+1 in haste, and that's something you do a lot on that first activation. So finding a way to discard it is nice. The good news is Specialize has you discard, and there are a few other cards in the format that let you discard cards too. And you know, slapping this on one of your creatures to make it a better attacker isn't bad either, because you know you get some value back from the Craving, even if that creature dies. This definitely isn't great, but I think you do play 1 copy of this in a lot of aggressive red decks, especially those that can get it in the graveyard. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Dragonborn Immolator, which for 3 generic and a red is a 2/4 dragon shaman at uncommon. You can pay 1 generic and a red and he gets +1/+0 until end of turn, and when it dies you note its power, and you get a boon with when you cast your next creature spell, it perpetually gets +X/+0, where X is the noted number. Probably should have mentioned these digital-only mechanics earlier in the video, but obviously perpetually means that a card forever gets this text attached to it. Doesn't matter what zone the card moves between or anything like that, it will forever have that effect. And a boon is just an effect that triggers when something happens, and it's a one-shot thing, like what the Dragonborn Immolator does here. So a 4 mana 2/4 that can get +1/+0 for 2 mana is probably pretty close to a C+, so the death trigger here is really sweet, as no matter what, it's going to make your next creature better. I think this is a B-. Next up, it's Flames of Moradin, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a rare sorcery. It says destroy up to 3 target artifacts, conjure a duplicate of each non-token artifact destroyed this way into your hand. The duplicates perpetually gain, you may pay red rather than pay this spell's mana cost, and at the beginning of your end step, sacrifice this artifact. So Conjure means that you create sort of like a token version of a card, except it's a token that has a mana cost and can move between zones and still be a real card, unlike a token which disappears. So in this case, you get duplicates put directly into your hand of the artifacts you destroy, and that's pretty cool. But this isn't really a very good card in Limited. There just aren't enough artifacts in this set for this to be worth it. If the set had a big artifact theme, this would be a different story because you could destroy some big artifacts and then cast them for 1, and even though they're going to go away, it doesn't really matter because you're casting a powerful, hasty artifact creature for 1 red, but there's just not enough of that in this format. You could use it to destroy your own artifacts for value too, but again, there's just not enough. You know, this format is not an artifact format. There's not an archetype in this set that cares about artifacts, and this card's kind of an outlier. One that's probably here to enable like wacky alchemy decks that let you make cheap copies of things, rather than a card that's here for Limited, and I think it's just an F in Limited. It's maybe a sideboard card. If you run into somebody who has like 5 artifacts or something in their deck, this suddenly looks a lot better, and you could probably bring it in, but that's going to be a rare occurrence. Next up, it's Genasi Rabble Rouser, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/3 elemental shaman at common. It's got double team, and you can pay 1 generic and a red, and creatures you control named Genasi Rabble Rouser get +1/+0 until end of turn. Double team is a new mechanic in this set. It means that when this creature attacks, you conjure a copy of it into your hand, and then both lose double team. This looks like a strong common. A 2-mana 1/3 with this ability is probably already a C, so obviously adding double team to the mix is pretty nice. They can even start pumping each other once you have another copy of this in play, whether it's a double teamed copy or otherwise. This looks like a pretty sweet 2-drop overall. I'm giving this a C+. It's hard for a lot of these double team cards to be good because they have built-in 2-for-1 potential. Next up, it's Giant Fire Beetles, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/2 insect at common, and it has Menace and double team. So again, this has a built-in 2-for-1. Having Menace means it will be able to effectively attack and get you a copy on a lot of boards, and you'll be willing to attack with these double team creatures anytime. You'll also be able to get something off of your opponent's board. So yeah, even if they have like a 2/2 and a 5/5 and they use both to block this, you're happy killing the 2/2, getting another Fire Beetles, and then just playing it. Like, that's gonna feel fine. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Gnoll Hunting Party, which for 5 generic and a red is a 4/4 Gnoll at uncommon, and it costs 1 less to cast for each creature you attacked with this turn. It has double team, and as long as it's your turn, it has first strike. So this is really strong. I think if you can make this cost 5, you're going to feel pretty good about it, and anything less than that is going to feel great. The whole double team thing will give you another copy of this fairly large creature, and the second copy is going to cost 5 at the worst because you will have attacked with your Gnoll Hunting Party that turn to get double team going in the first place. This looks like a really premier sort of top curve aggressive creature for red decks. It makes sure you're still gonna have gas, like even after you've curved out and done a bunch to your opponent. And you know, this creature is not easy to block. Like a 4/4 first strike is relevant all game long. This is a very good uncommon. I'm giving it a B. Next up, we've got Goblin Trap Finder, which is 1 red mana for a 1/1 goblin at uncommon, and when it dies, you seek a creature card with mana value 3 or less. That card perpetually gains haste. This spell costs 2 less to cast, and at the beginning of your end step, sacrifice this creature. So Seek means that you get a random card from your deck that meets some criteria. In this case, it has to be a creature card with a mana value of 3 or less. So this looks like decent sacrifice fodder since it provides you with 2 separate bodies. You can look at this as a 1 mana 1/1 that draws you a card when it dies, and yes, the card you draw is a very specific one, but you know it's not going to be a land, and you know it's going to be something with haste, so, you know, that's not too bad. This is probably at its best in black-red, where you have some sacrifice going on, but it seems like a fine inclusion in pretty much any red deck. I mean, you know, getting a 3 mana value creature that you can cast for 1 and giving it haste and having to sacrifice it seems like decent value. I'm giving this a C. Next, we've got Incessant Provocation, which for 3 generic and a red is a common sorcery. And it says gain control of target creature until end of turn, untap that creature, it gains haste until end of turn. It perpetually gains, this creature attacks each combat if able. As usual, the threat and effect in this set is pretty much a build around. There is sacrifice stuff around in this set, just like there was in Forgotten Realms. Sepulchre Ghoul is in this format at common, it can sacrifice things for free, and there are a few other outlets that are free or cheap to sacrifice things too. And if you have those kinds of cards, Provocation is going to be really good, since you can steal their creature and then sacrifice it for serious value and basically turn this into a removal spell, an insane removal spell, really. However, if you don't have more than like 3 or 4 ways to sacrifice creatures, this card really isn't very good. It does forever give the card, this creature attacks each combat if able, and that's something, but it's not really going to justify you paying 4 mana for this card most of the time. This can be good, like if you're near lethal and stealing their best thing gives you lethal, but it becomes way too situational of a card in a deck that doesn't also have ways to sacrifice it. So it's like a D in a typical red deck and a C+ and a pretty key role player in like a black-red sacrifice deck. Next up, it's Cardoom, Patron of Flames, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 4/3 legendary demon at rare. He's got haste, and when he attacks, you put a flame counter on it, then seek a card with mana value equal to the number of flame counters on it and exile that card face down. When Cardoom dies, you put all cards you own exiled with it into your hand. At the beginning of the end step of your next turn, you discard those cards. So a 4 mana 4/3 with haste is probably a C+, maybe a C at worst, and then this comes with what is mostly upside since it will seek and exile cards every single time it attacks. And a 4/3 is big enough that on most boards your opponent does have to make a decision about what to do about Cardoom. Then when it dies, you get some pretty serious value back. Now you do have to use those cards quickly or you lose them, but you'll be able to get at least 1 card out of Cardoom most of the time. You should value a 1-drop or a couple of 1-drops a little more than usual if you have Cardoom, because if he always draws you one like on his first attack, that's going to feel pretty good. He does definitely get worse, because a lot of the time you're going to play him, attack with him, and your opponent will kill him. And if you're not getting the 2-for-1 out of that, it's not going to feel amazing. But on top of that, if Cardoom then goes unchecked and starts building more and more cards under it, and then you can sacrifice it to something, or just, you know, keep hitting your opponent for 4 with it, which will eventually kill them, you put them in a pretty bad place. This looks pretty good to me. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Kobold Warcaller, which for 1 red mana is a 1/1 Kobold at common, and you can tap it and choose a creature card in your hand, and it perpetually gains haste. We see a lot of 1 mana 1/1s that can tap and give haste to things, and they tend to be alright in formats with legit aggro decks. This is an upgrade beyond that because you don't actually have to cast your creature for it to get the haste. You can use this during your opponent's end step and then cast the haste creature on your turn, for example. It doesn't matter if the Warcaller dies later, you still have haste on that creature. You can use it to like upgrade a bunch of expensive cards in your hand ahead of time, and all of that means this is a pretty reasonable 1-drop with some pretty real upside. It's definitely not like amazing or anything, but I think you play the first copy of this in a lot of aggro decks in red. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Mephit's Enthusiasm, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon sorcery, and it deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If excess damage was dealt this way, note that excess damage, then you get a boon with, when you cast your next creature spell, it perpetually gets +X+0, where X is the noted number. So this is premium removal. 2 mana for 4 damage is great, even on a sorcery, so the fact that you'll sometimes get to buff your next creature is a pretty big deal. Now, a lot of the time you're not going to get to buff your creature, or it just gives +1/+0 to something. Most of the time this isn't just going to like make things incredible for your next creature, but it is going to make a lot of your next creatures a little bit better on top of a card that's already an amazing removal spell. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Tiefling Outcasts, which for 1 red mana is a 1/1 Tiefling Peasant at rare. It's got double team, and other demons, devils, imps, and tieflings you control get +1/+0. It's kind of crazy to see a 1 mana lord, and that's definitely what this is. The +1/+0 boost will pump a reasonable number of red creatures in this set. We've already seen that in this video, and we've seen it throughout the week. And if you can find a way to get in with the Outcasts, you even get a second copy, which is going to be pretty impressive on a lot of boards. And at worst, you also have 2 2/1s. The problem is actually attacking with this for value will be pretty difficult from like turn 3 on, maybe even turn 2 on, so you shouldn't really count on it doing what you want it to do. I mean, if you play this on turn 1, your opponent doesn't play a 1-drop, and then you attack with it on turn 2, and then play another Outcast, that's going to feel really, really good, but there's going to be a lot of games where getting the double team going just isn't going to be worth it, because the Outcasts will die anyway. So, yeah, I mean, it's a pretty good card, and there are enough things that it buffs, but it does have kind of diminishing returns in terms of double team late. The nice thing is it's always a 1-drop that will pump like a creature or two, and that's pretty nice. I think this is a C overall. Next up, it's Unexpected Allies, which for 1 generic and a red is a common sorcery, and it says target non-token creature you control gets +2/+0 and gains double team until end of turn. It also gains first strike until end of turn if it has the same name as another creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard. I'm not a huge fan of this, mostly because at sorcery speed it is very easy to disrupt. Your opponent need only respond in like a ton of different ways to get a 2-for-1 when you cast this. Now, if you do wait until your opponent's shields are down, this can do some stuff since it makes your creature hit harder and gives double team to that creature, and sometimes that will be sweet because you'll be able to attack with a creature a little more effectively. The best your opponent can do is perhaps trade, and then you get a copy of that creature in your hand. And sometimes you'll get first strike. I wouldn't count on that happening a lot. The idea here is sort of that you'll have other double team stuff going on, so you'll have duplicates in your deck, and you'll just have duplicates of common creatures sometimes anyway. But yeah, this whole sorcery speed kind of thing just seems too risky for me, and the upside isn't that impressive. This is probably just a D+. Next up, it's Uthgardt Fury, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a rare enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage to any target. Damage isn't removed from creatures your opponents control during cleanup steps. This is really good. I would always be on a 3-mana enchantment that does 4 to anything when it enters. That already is probably a B. And on top of that, this has a pretty crazy rules change. The first time I read this, I thought it was symmetrical, but it isn't. It only hurts your opponent, and it makes it so their creatures are significantly worse since damage won't go away anymore. That suddenly turns chump blocks into riskier propositions. That turns attacking in general into a riskier proposition. If you have a repeatable source of damage, it's going to cause a lot of problems. I do think that this effect, while good, is going to have a more minimal effect than it might seem at first, because in Magic there aren't that many situations where you damage a creature without killing it. I mean, I basically named all of them, they involve combat usually. But I don't think this will have like a completely warping effect on the game in terms of its additional effect, but it's a great removal spell with a bonus effect attached to it. I think it's a B+. Next up, we've got Warriors of Tiamat, which for 4 generic and a red is a 4/2 dragon warrior at common with haste and double team. So a 5-mana 4/2 with haste isn't something that's usually very good, but combining haste with double team is pretty nice, since it means, unlike a lot of other double team creatures, you can get that extra copy right away. And that's going to be sort of the vulnerability of these double team creatures, is if your opponent kills them before you get the second copy, you're going to not gain the value that you're playing the card for. Of course, the downside in this case is a lot of cheap creatures, like a 2-mana 2/2, can just trade with this, but they still have to find a way to deal with it twice, and it's not like it doesn't hit hard when they're not blocking it. It's also a dragon, which certainly matters in this set. This seems like a C to me. Next up, we've got Ancient Copper Dragon, which for 4 generic and 2 red is a 6/5 Elder Dragon at Mythic Rare. It's got flying, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you roll a d20. On Arena, this means a random number is generated between 1 and 20, and then you get some effect. In this case, you create a number of tokens equal to the result of your roll. So a 6-mana 6/5 flyer is already about a B. So this generating a bunch of treasure tokens when it hits your opponent is some big upside. Now, you won't always have something to spend that treasure on, mind you, but mana sinks and card draw spells can make sure you do. Plus, if you're in red, you may have some cards that give you bonuses for using up treasure in different ways. I don't think it takes over the game as impressively as the white, black, or green dragons in this cycle, since it doesn't add or improve your board inherently, but it is still a highly efficient creature with a very real upside effect. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Bartle Cry Goblin, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 goblin at uncommon. You can pay 1 generic and a red, and goblins you control get +1/+0 and gain haste until end of turn. And it has Pack Tactics. Whenever it attacks, if you attacked with creatures with total power 6 or greater, and that's what Pack Tactics is, it's a returning mechanic from Forgotten Realms, you get some sort of effect when you attack with creatures with 6 or more power. And in this case, you make a 1/1 red goblin creature token that's tapped and attacking. Look what's back. This was arguably the best uncommon in all of Forgotten Realms Limited. It can really get Pack Tactics going pretty easily, all on its own thanks to its pump effect, and if you have other goblins around, it becomes even more absurd, and there are definitely some others around, one of which we've already seen in this video. What really makes it great is that it's basically a 2-drop that scales all game long. It tends to basically feel like an X spell in that way, because you can just play it and use all your mana to buff it and your other goblins and attack with it right away, which usually also means you get a token token, so it basically always comes down as a very relevant creature no matter when you play it. Forgotten Realms was certainly a different format than this one, but I think this is an amazing uncommon in virtually any limited format. It's the kind of card that really pushes aggressive decks into an impressive space. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, we've got Breath Weapon, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon instant, and it deals 2 damage to each non-dragon creature. So we see a tribal payoff board sweeper that does like 2 to all creatures that don't have a certain type. We see them all the time, and they're basically always disappointed. And that's because there's too many situations where they don't do enough. Sure, if you're playing this, you probably have a bunch of dragons, but there's a lot of dragons in this set, especially in the Temur colors, and if your opponent's in any of those colors, it stands to reason they'll also have several dragons, and it also doesn't kill bigger things. So there's a wide number of creatures that Breath Weapon just can't kill, and that makes it a really unimpressive card. And you know, you're also not going to have all dragons in your deck, you'll have things that die to it. It's just very hard to make it work. I do think it's a sideboard card. Like, you can probably play it at a D level if you're in a dragon deck, and out of your sideboard, if you're up against someone who doesn't have that many dragons and has a bunch of small creatures, suddenly bringing it in makes sense. It's probably a C in a situation like that. Next up, it's Carnelian Orb of Dragonkind, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon artifact, and you can tap it and add red, and if that mana is spent on a dragon creature spell, it gains haste until end of turn. I'm more interested in this orb than I was in the blue one, which I wasn't impressed with at all, as giving a dragon haste is a pretty big deal. That said, I'm still not in love with a 3-mana mana rock that produces mana from only a single color. Not adding to the board can just be so brutal these days. I think this deserves a build-around grade. If your deck has 5 or more dragons, and especially a few that are 5 or 6 drops, it's probably a C, but in all other red decks, it's probably unplayable. Next up, it's Dragon's Fire, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you may reveal a dragon card from your hand, or choose a dragon you control. It deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If you reveal the dragon card or chose a dragon as you cast this spell, it deals damage equal to the power of that card or creature instead. This was premium in Forgotten Realms, and it's probably a little better here because there's even more dragons in this set. I mean, if you start out at a 2-mana card that does 3 damage to a creature at instant speed, you're already talking about premium removal, so adding this dragon upside where it'll be doing 4 or 5 damage or 6 damage, a decent chunk of the time, you're talking about an even better card. This is probably Red's best common. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Dueling Rapier, which for 1 red mana is a common artifact equipment. When it enters the battlefield, you attach it to target creature you control and has flash, and the equipped creature gets +2/+0, and the equip cost is 4. This ended up being surprisingly solid in Forgotten Realms, but that format turned out to be fairly aggressive, and there was also an equipment deck in the format, and those things aren't really true here. So mostly this is a 1-mana trick that gives +2/+0 to something, and then the bonus sticks around. I mean, that's not terrible, but the fact it doesn't pump the creature's toughness at all means that it's not really going to help your creature survive combat so much as it'll help it take something down. So then you're stuck with an equip for equipment, and that just doesn't feel especially good. This seems pretty mediocre in this set, especially compared to where it was in Forgotten Realms. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Earth Cult Elemental, which for 4 generic and 2 red is a 6/6 elemental at common. When it enters the battlefield, you roll a d20. If you roll a 1 through 9, each player sacks a permanent. If you roll a 10 through 19, each opponent sacrifices a permanent. And if you roll a 20, each opponent sacrifices 2 permanents. This wasn't that good in Forgotten Realms. I mean, it has passable stats, but 6 drops that didn't do something really meaningful like gain you life were kind of a liability in that format. It will probably be a little better here, but its Enter the Battlefield ability isn't that great either. By the time this comes down, many players have expendable permanents, so it's mostly the kind of thing your opponent can just shrug about. It's passable as a top curve creature, but that's about it. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Faraday's Fireball, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a common instant. It deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker, and you roll a d20. If you roll a 1 through 9, it deals 2 damage to each player, and if you roll a 10 through 20, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. This is another Forgotten Realms reprint. It was solid removal in that format, though it definitely wasn't premium, just a little too clunky, a little too expensive. But you know, having one of these in a lot of your red decks is perfectly fine. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Fiend Lash, which for 1 generic and a red is a rare artifact equipment. The equipped creature gets +2/+0 and has reach, and when the equipped creature is dealt damage, it deals damage equal to its power to target player or planeswalker, and it has an equip cost of 2 generic and a red. So 2 mana to cast and 3 to equip for +2/+0 when reach is not the greatest card. Like, if that's all this was, it would probably be a D+. But the whole damage part of the card is very spicy and definitely provides a huge upgrade. Because it bumps the power of your creature, it's likely that it can do some significant damage anytime it gets damaged. So you equip this to your creature and attack, and your opponent kind of just has to take it because blocking could lose them a creature and then they still take the same amount of damage. It's nice that it adds reach to the mix too, so you can use it defensively. You can even, roadblock some flyers with this. The ideal situation, if you have the mana, would be putting this on a thing to attack every turn, and then in your second main phase, moving it to something that you want to block. And if you're doing that, your opponent is going to have a hard time finding a way to kill you before their life reaches 0. That does cost a whole lot of mana. It's clunky to move around, but the creatures you put this on automatically become very problematic for your opponent to deal with, and I think that makes it pretty strong. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Hobgoblin Captain, which for 1 generic and a red is a 3/1 Goblin Barbarian at common, and when it attacks, if you attack with creatures with total power 6 or greater this combat, it gains first strike until end of turn. So this was one of the great 2-drops in Forgotten Realms that made the format as fast as it was, and it's probably going to be pretty good here too. It gets you halfway to pack tactics on its own, and once it has first strike, it becomes a relevant creature basically no matter what the board looks like. This is going to be one of Red's best commons. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Improvised Weaponry, which for 2 generic and a red is a common sorcery. It deals 2 damage to any target, and you create a treasure token. This was solid in Forgotten Realms. It killed enough creatures in the format that it sort of even overperformed there. It may not be quite as good here, where it looks like there's more large creatures and more late game more often, but 3 mana to do 2 to anything and getting a treasure back is still a solid deal. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Jaded Sellsword, which for 3 generic and a red is a 4/3 Dragon Warrior at common, and when it enters the battlefield, if mana from a treasure was spent to cast it, it gains first strike and haste until end of turn. Ramping into this on turn 3 with treasure felt pretty solid. I mean, it usually could attack and your opponent couldn't do anything about it that turn. But there are a lot of times where you just don't do that, and it's just not an especially good card when you don't. These days, a 4 mana 4/3 is like a D. So, it gets an upgrade certainly from the ability, but it's not going to be that impressive. I think it's probably a C-. Next up, it's now Feshni, which for 5 generic and a red is a 4/6 Beast Demon at rare. It's got flying. Whenever you cast a spell from exile, you copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. If it's a permanent spell, the copy gains haste, and at the beginning of the end step, sacrifice this permanent. So this is pretty strong. A 6 mana 4/6 flyer is probably a C+ or a B- at worst. Like, those are pretty efficient stats. But then this card also is insane if you start casting things from exile. And this format has adventures in it. That means you're going to be casting things from exile. And when you start doubling those things, which are usually going to be creatures, there's a few in this format. There's actually several adventures in this format that aren't creatures. Most of them will be. But when you cast that creature, you basically get a second copy of the creature that has haste and it can attack right away and then gets sacrificed. And that is pretty insane. This can generate a ton of value. I do think, in red, there are adventures, of course, but there aren't so many that you'll always just be able to get all this value out of the card. But, I mean, if you're just playing this and you have like 3 or 4 cards that are adventures, maybe a card that lets you play something from exile off of like an impulse draw effect, it's going to be really strong. Like, just doubling one of your adventure creatures is going to be crazy. I think this is a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next, it's Reckless Barbarian, which for 1 generic into red is a 2/2 Dragon Barbarian at common, and you can sacrifice it to add 2 red. So this is a bear that has a useful creature type and an ability that is upside. These creatures who can sack for mana are generally not as good as they look. They give you fast mana for sure, but you also have to give up a whole card just to get that mana, and that kind of thing is significantly worse in most limited formats, like Dark Ritual, for example, which is sort of one of the main cards that does this sort of thing. Not nearly as good in limited as it is in other formats, because you can set yourself up for a 2-for-1 if you ramp into something and your opponent just kills it. Not that hard to do in limited. And that is something that can happen here too. But in the meantime, it is a 2 mana 2/2, and then it can help you ramp into things later. It's also a card that sacrifices itself. There's value there. It's definitely solid. I'm just saying its ability to sacrifice itself isn't going to be as impressive as it looks. We've seen this on cards like Treasure Hound and Skirk Prospector in the past. I think this is just a C. Next up, it's Red Dragon, which for 4 generic and 2 red is a 4/4 dragon at uncommon. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage to each opponent. This is not the most exciting dragon for them to reprint in this set. It isn't bad. I mean, a 6 mana 4/4 flyer is overcosted, but I think the Enter the Battlefield ability here does enough to make up for that. but it's still just a solid playable and not much else. You don't usually even want more than one of these, even in a dragon deck. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we've got Storm King's Thunder, which for X and 3 red is a mythic rare instant, and when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, you copy that spell X times and you choose new targets for the copies. This card's cool, but it isn't really here for limited. You need a bunch of mana and a spell that's still cheap enough you can cast it for this to be worth it. Paying 4 to make only a single copy of some cheap spell normally isn't going to feel great. You probably need to be making 2 copies with this to feel like you're getting there, and that means you kind of need 5 mana and a spell that you can still cast that turn to get it doubled, and it's going to be hard to set that up, even in a format that has treasure and stuff. This is going to be a completely dead card way too often, and it's going to be underwhelming really often too. I think it's probably just an F in limited. Next up, it's Swashbuckler Extraordinaire, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/2 Dragon Rogue Warrior at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, you make a treasure token, and when you attack, you may sacrifice 1 or more treasures. When you do, up to that many target creatures gain double strike until end of turn. This is pretty sweet. A 3 mana 2/2 that makes a treasure is already pretty close to a C, so the fact that this also gives you a very powerful treasure payoff is pretty nice. Double strike is no joke, especially if you have a creature with evasion, or if you have multiple treasure and you can give multiple creatures double strike in the same turn. So like if you play this, it has an impact right away, because it doesn't matter if it attacks, all that matters is that you attack. And anytime you do, you get the option to sack a treasure and give something double strike, and you can actually sack any number of treasures, which is really interesting. Normally when we see an effect like this, it's like you can sack 1 treasure and get a bonus. In this case, if you have as many treasures as you have creatures, you can give all your creatures double strike. Now, most of the time, you're probably only going to be able to give like 1 thing double strike, but there are going to be decks in this format that can produce enough treasure that you can end up playing this on a turn, attack with 3 things, and give them all double strike. Like, that's going to be a real turn. This is just has such a good baseline, and then it's such a powerful treasure payoff that it seems great to me. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Two-Handed Axe, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon artifact equipment. Whenever a equipped creature attacks, double its power until end of turn, and you can equip it for 1 generic and a red. It comes with an adventure, which means in this case you can also cast it as Sweeping Cleave for 1 generic and a red, and when you do cast it that way, it gets exiled, and then you can cast the permanent side of the card later in the game. You don't have to do that in order to cast Two-Handed Axe. If you just want the axe right away, you can do it. But anyway, the adventure here is an instant that says target creature you control gains double strike until end of turn. So a trick that just gives double strike usually isn't that great in limited, but you can use this pretty happily in the early game just to chip in for more damage if you want, ahead of casting this equipment. Normally you don't want to cast a trick just to do more damage early, but because you're going to get a whole card out of this later, it's okay to do. And there will be times where this double strike effect also helps you win combat. Having a random double strike, on an instant also sometimes just gives you lethal out of nowhere. It's a pretty nice trick. I mean, it's not amazing since it doesn't boost the creature or give it trample or any of these things that you usually like to pair with double strike, but it definitely has some real utility in the earlier part of the game. The equipment side of it isn't incredible either. It only doubles the creature's power, so it's not going to make your creature any better at surviving combat. It will make it into a better attacker and make it harder for your opponent to do anything but trade with the creature. But, not raising toughness definitely matters. I think overall, this is a solid card. Most cards, the cards of Double Team are all mostly good because they give you 2 things. That's kind of true of Adventures too. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Unexpected Windfall, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a common instant, and as an additional cost to cast it, you discard a card and you draw 2 cards and create 2 treasure tokens. This is a card that has been great in Constructed, but it's really not that impressive in Limited. Spending 4 mana and giving up 2 cards to get 2 cards and a couple of treasure just doesn't feel that impactful. That doesn't mean this is bad, but it definitely isn't something you run in all your red decks. It's sort of the mantra of limited formats these days. You got to be adding to the board. This doesn't do it. You only have so many slots in your deck where you cannot be doing it. So, playing 1 copy of this is fine. It even fixes your mana for you and stuff, but it's probably just a C-. Next up, it's Valor Singer, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/3 Tiefling Bard at common, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn. This was a pretty good common in Forgotten Realms, and I think it is here too. +1/+0 might not sound like a lot, but you'd be surprised how often that boost can really improve your attacks. It can even pop itself, so it's basically a 3 mana 3/3 if that's what you need, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Wrathful Red Dragon, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 5/5 dragon. At rare, it's got flying, and when a dragon you control is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any target that isn't a dragon. So This is really good. A 5-mana 5/5 flyer is a B, and the upside here is very real. If the only way your opponent can deal with this dragon is by blocking or damaging it, well, they're probably going to lose since the dragon can do damage to pretty much anything, either finishing off your opponent or serving as removal. This means you're going to get a 2-for-1 almost every time you play this at worst. It also offers this bonus to all of your dragons, so the turn you play this, if you already have a couple dragons you can attack with, that's going to be amazing. I just don't see that many ways where your opponent can interact with this card and come out ahead. There are a few. They involve aura removal spells, and a bounce effect can slow things down, but it's just so strong, and it seems like it impacts the board immediately, and it's going to be hard not to get a 2-for-1. And obviously it has great stats. It can just end the game in the sky, even if its ability never matters. This is a huge bomb. I'm giving it an A+. I actually think it's better than the Elder Dragon, the Mythic Elder Dragon in the red one in that cycle, which is kind of funny. Next up, it's you come to the Gnoll camp, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant. You have 2 options. One is 2 target creatures can't block this turn, and the other is target creature gets +3/+1 until end of turn. Neither option here is very good. Individually, they both be like a D. They're just both so situational. +3/+1 for 2 mana isn't a trick you normally play. It's not a big enough boost to toughness. You want to be playing 2 mana +3/+3. That's kind of the benchmark for a good limited trick, and this falls well short of that. And the ability to make things unable to block also only really matters when it gives you a situation where you can just win the game on the spot. And those things come up for sure, but it's still not a very good card. It's one that you usually don't run, giving it a D+. Next up, it's you find some prisoners, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant. It says, choose 1, destroy target artifact, or exile the top 3 cards of target opponent's library, choose 1 of them. Until the end of your next turn, you may play that card, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. So this either lets you shatter something, or it lets you take the best card from your opponent's top 3. While the latter option is definitely sweet, it isn't actually that powerful because you're still just getting back 1 card with it. It's sort of like a reverse Anticipate, which is always an okay card, but nothing special. There are enough artifacts in this set that I actually think you'll have targets reasonably often for the first part, so you can main deck this, and I don't think it's a travesty if you do. I think you'll frequently not have a target, and when you don't, it's just this weird reverse Anticipate. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's Young Red Dragon, which for 3 generic and a red is a 3/2 dragon at common. It has an adventure called Bathe in Gold, and for 1 generic and a red, it's an instant that makes a treasure token, and it's a 3/2 flyer that can't block. So, nice common. It makes you a treasure early, which can actually allow you to play this very dragon on turn 3, which can be pretty nice. It can also be used for other purposes too, of course, but that's sort of the internal synergy this card has. It, of course, can't block, but, that can be a liability. You probably don't want to play this in your deck if you're not aggressive, but if you are, it's a pretty nice card. I'm giving it a C+. All right, the remaining cards for us to look at are all specialized cards. Specialize is a new mechanic in this set where you pay some amount of mana and discard a card to turn your card, basically transform it into something else. You can only do it at sorcery speed. Our first of these is Ambergris, Citadel Agent, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/2 legendary creature dwarf cleric at uncommon. She's got haste and specialize 3, and when she attacks, you can discard your hand and draw 2 cards. So when you specialize, what the creature becomes depends on the type of land you discard or the color of the card you discard. So if you discard a mountain or a red card, you get Ambergris, Agent of Destruction, who's a 4/3. All of these are 4/3s in this case. They all still let you discard your hand and draw some number of cards. Most of them it's still just 2, but we'll see some of them have different variants. And then they add some other effect for when you discard cards on your turn. So if you discard a mountain or a red card, like I said, you have a card that still has haste and has that effect, and you do X damage to each opponent, where X is the number of cards you've discarded this turn when you do, discard cards with her. Ambergris, Agent of Law, is the white one. It holds on to haste. Still discard your hand and draw 2. And now when you do that, the other creatures you control get +X/+X, where X is the number of cards you've discarded. If you discard an island or a blue card, instead of discarding your hand and drawing 2 cards, you draw 3 cards. Ambergris, Agent of Tyranny, is the black one. Now, when you use the, discard your hand, draw 2 cards effect, she also gives you -X/-X until end of turn to one of your opponent's creatures, so basically removal. And then the green one lets you put X +1/+1 counters on another target creature you control, where X is the number of cards you've discarded this turn. So A 3-mana 3/2 with haste that can let you throw your hand away to draw 2 cards is a card you'd basically always play in Limited, probably a C+ at worst. That attack trigger can actually be pretty good because it means you can simply discard your hand of 0 or 1 cards and you actually gain cards. Then once it specializes, all but the blue one gives you a bonus for discarding cards, whereas the blue one just improves that ability. And keep in mind, even if you have 0 cards in your hand, you discarded a card that turn to specialize in the first place. So the first turn you play this, there's the potential to do, a lot with these abilities. You do have to sort of play around it and think about the fact that you want to hold on to cards to get full value out of it. But even if you're not doing that, you end up with a card that's going to give you a lot of value. These specialized cards are virtually all quite good, and this is no exception to that. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Goot, Fanatical Priestess, which for 4 generic and 2 red is a 4/3 legendary goblin shaman. At uncommon, it specializes 5, and when it enters the battlefield, up to 1 target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. If the creature you don't control would die this turn, exile it instead. All of Goot's specialized forms are 5/4s, and they all let you do something with the creature that got exiled from the fight effect. So if you discard a mountain or a red card, you just get a straight up copy of the creature card in play with haste, and it gets sacrificed at the beginning of your end step. It has double strike 2, actually. The white one makes 2 tokens that are copies of the creature that got exiled, except they're 2/2s and have haste, and then they get sacrificed. The blue one makes it into a 3/3 flying haste that gets sacrificed. The black one makes it a 4/4 menace haste that gets sacrificed, and the green one makes it a 5/5 trample haste that gets sacrificed. So again, specialized card, it looks pretty nice overall. This might be the worst of the specialized cards in the format, but I still think it's pretty good. The main thing is 6 mana is a lot for a 4/3, and while she does set up a fight when she comes down, you won't always be able to make a fight happen that actually exiles a creature. And you have to exile something with Goot, or specializing her doesn't matter much. It'll improve her stats, that's basically it. And that's not really going to be worth it unless you have absolutely nothing to do with your mana and a card in your hand. Now, if you do exile something with her, you get a pretty big payoff because you get a pretty powerful creature token with haste in addition to upgrading Goot's stats. But the token does go away, so it's a 1-turn thing where maybe you do a bunch of damage and then your opponent the coast is clear kind of for your opponent. I think Goot is really good, but I think she's probably a C+. I just see too many situations where you can't effectively set up a fight that makes her specialized worthwhile. Next up, it's Karlach, Raging Tiefling, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 legendary Tiefling Barbarian at rare. It's got first strike. His specialize is 6, but you can also activate it if Karlach is in the graveyard. So all of Karlach's different forms are 4/4s, and they all gain haste, and if you specialize from the graveyard, he comes back from the graveyard and perpetually gains the ability that it can't block. And then they all also have a bonus when he specializes, period, whether it's from the graveyard or from in play. The red one makes it so a creature an opponent controls can't block this turn, which is pretty nice when you add a huge haste creature to the battlefield. The white one makes a 2/2 White Knight creature token, and creatures you control also get +1/+1 and haste until end of turn, which is insane. The blue one lets you seek an instant or sorcery card with mana value 3 or less, and you can cast that card without paying its mana cost. The black one allows you the option of sacrificing a creature, and if you do, you draw 2 cards and your opponent loses 2 life. And the green one makes another target creature get +4/+4 until end of turn. So a 2-mana 2/2 with first strike is usually a B-. That's just a great 2-drop that's hard to deal with in combat early. It's really good with tricks and other sort of enhancements. So the specialized upside here is really good. 6 mana is a lot to specialize, but the things that Karlach does when he specializes into almost all of these forms are going to be well worth 6 mana and discarding a card, and that becomes especially true because he can come back from the graveyard. So if you play Karlach early and your opponent does kill him, they're able to deal with your 2/2, which can happen. They have to worry the whole game about when you specialize it later, and it comes back and does insane stuff. To me, it feels like the white one is the craziest because it buffs your whole board and gives you a creature token, but they all give you serious value. I mean, the blue one's a little less aggressive. The other ones pretty much all do fairly aggressive things. I mean, even the black one, which draws you cards, hurts your opponent, so, I can still get on board with that being aggressive. But they're all good. They all net you a card worth of value, so you get the card back from Specialize and then some. This seems like a bomb to me. I'm giving him an A-. And our last card in this video is Will, Pact-Bound Duelist, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 4/4 legendary human warlock at Mythic Rare. He specializes for 2, and when he enters the battlefield, you gain control of target artifact or creature an opponent controls with mana value 4 or less until the end of your next turn. Keep in mind it says next turn. We're used to seeing these red effects that only last until end of turn. This case, it lasts until the end of your next turn, and that matters because when Will specializes, he gives you the option of sacrificing an artifact or a creature, and then you get some bonus effect. So the idea here is that you would play Will 1 turn, steal their thing, and then specialize Will to sacrifice their thing. You may be able to do it all in the same turn if you have 7 mana, and if you do, that's a good idea because that means your opponent won't be able to kill Will before you go crazy with Will. But you're not always going to be able to do it all in 1 turn. And the fact that you hold on to that permanent until you're at the end of your next turn means that you can specialize that next turn and sacrifice it. So with the red version, you get an additional combat phase. They're all 5/5s, by the way. You get an additional combat phase. So that's one that is a little weird because you're going to want to use it in the second main phase is when you're going to want to wait to specialize. So you get that second combat step. The white one lets you reanimate a creature card from your graveyard when you sacrifice an artifact or enchantment. And then if its mana value is 4 or greater, you do have to sacrifice it at the beginning of your next end step. A lot of the time you'll want to get something permanent, but sometimes getting back something huge and giving it haste will also be great. The blue one returns an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand when you sacrifice the thing. The black one has you draw 3 cards unless an opponent pays 5 life. And the green one perpetually gives Will +3/+3 and trample. So this is really good. You're going to be able to steal their thing and sacrifice it for serious value no matter how you specialize Will. Some of them are a little grindier, like, you know, especially the blue one is kind of a grindy card. The rest are all pretty aggressive, kind of like we saw with the last specialized creature too. This just looks like a bomb to me. It just has such a powerful built-in ability to remove an opponent's creature and simultaneously give you serious value. This is an A. So those are all the red cards in Alchemy Horizons Baldur's Gate. Tomorrow I'll be completing the card by card portion of the set review with a look at the green and colorless cards. If you want to make sure you stay aware of that video, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the rest of the review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon or by becoming a YouTube member. Thanks for watching.